My name is Marjorie Prokosch. I want to preface this with I am not a population geneticist. I'm actually a graduate evolutionary psychologist at Texas Christian University. And today I'm here to talk to you about how chronic vulnerability to infection affects life history theory and decision making. So first, if we want to talk about life history theory, you need to know what life history theory is. I'm sure, given where we are, most of you are at least familiar with the theory, but just in case, I'll go over it again. Life history theory is an optimality theory that predicts how, where, and when organisms will allocate their limited energy across the lifespan to maximize fitness in their local ecology. And so energy is limited. As somebody I admire once said, you can only spend a calorie once. And unfortunately, a lot of our needs compete with each other. So expending energy on reproduction necessarily comes at the cost of spending that same energy on something like somatic growth. And so organisms calibrate the decisions that they make about where to spend their energy, both consciously and unconsciously, across their lifespan based on cues in their local environment that affect morbidity and mortality. So organisms that come from a benign, predictable environment tend to favor what we call a slower life history strategy. So these organisms make a pattern of trade-offs that favor somatic growth, so they tend to have a longer juvenile period. They delay reproduction until later in life, have fewer offspring, but they invest more in these offspring in order to make them competitive. Organisms that come from a more harsh, unpredictable environment tend to follow what we call a faster life history strategy, in which they make trade-offs in favor of earlier reproduction. And so these organisms have shorter growth periods, they have more offspring, and they invest less in these offspring in the hopes that at least some of these offspring will survive in the unpredictable ecology that they live in. And so life history strategies can be seen in the day-to-day decisions that we make, both in normal circumstances and under stress. For example, some research by our colleagues in Minnesota have shown that childhood socioeconomic status affects how people react to resource scarcity in adulthood. So individuals that grow up in lower, more harsh socioeconomic environments tend to react to resource scarcity stress by valuing present immediate rewards and making decisions that are reflective of speeding up mating effort. Whereas people who come from these more benign, predictable, higher SES environments tend to react to resource scarcity threat by valuing future rewards and making decisions that are actually consistent with delaying reproduction and riding out the storm because they have the resources to do so. So to date, much of the experimental research on life history theory has looked at external factors that affect people's vulnerability to these extrinsic environmental threats, but a lot less is known about internal body cues that might affect how people react to extrinsic environmental threats. And one such extrinsic threat that might be impacted by an individual's body state is the threat of pathogens. So pathogens have been highly prevalent throughout human history, and they continue to be prevalent today. In fact, up to 15 million humans a year die from infectious disease worldwide. These are diseases including influenza, tuberculosis, AIDS, malaria, and the like. So we predict that a person's chronic vulnerability to illness should also affect how one responds to pathogen load and the types of decisions that an individual makes across their lifespan. So that's our research question in short. So our predictions are that disease-vulnerable individuals, so these are people that have less reactive immune systems. These are the people you know that are always getting sick. These individuals have what we'd like to call a chronic shorter shadow of the future. What this means is that for them, survival is chronically less certain because they have a bad immune system, and diseases that aren't a threat for most people do pose a threat for them because they don't have good immune function. So for these individuals, it's more adaptive to be present-focused and think in the present, because if survival is uncertain, why delay reward and why think ahead when you might not live to reap the rewards of behaving in such a way? So people who are low in vulnerability, so people with stronger immune systems and healthier bodies, typically future survival is more certain. So for these individuals, it's more adaptive to think ahead, delay gratification in favor of longer, bigger rewards, and accrue resources that way. Well, what about in conditions where disease threat is high? We predict that disease-vulnerable individuals, so again, these people who have weaker immune systems, will continue to be present-focused because for them, disease threat is always high, so it's always adaptive to think in the present. However, under conditions of high disease threat, and I'm talking about high mortality diseases, for these individuals, now that they're threatened, healthy individuals, they'll shift to having a more present focus, and you'll see them actually make decisions that are consistent with that. So our current research goals were to examine how one's vulnerability to diseases and cues of pathogen load impact behaviors that are consistent with fast versus slower life history strategies. And we did this correlationally in study 1, and in study 2, we did it experimentally. So for study 1, what we did was we brought in 109 TCU undergraduates, and we gave them a measure of temporal focus. So this was a delaying gratification inventory. It's a short 10-item form. It asks questions like, I've always felt like my hard work will pay off in the end. I have an easy time delaying gratification. And a higher score on the DGI, a mean score, means that somebody has an easier time delaying gratification. So that would be more representative of following a slower life history strategy, putting off the reward and thinking in the future. So for vulnerability to illness, we took a self-report measure of somebody's developmental and familial illness. So we asked them questions like, I've had to deal with a variety of medical issues in my lifetime. We had a reverse scored question that said, people in my family tend to live long and healthy lives. And so what we did was we formed a composite of their answers in which a higher score was indicative of having a poorer immune system and being more vulnerable to infection. We also took some other known predictors of fast versus slow life history strategy and factors that have been known to affect immune system quality. So we took measures of childhood SES, socioeconomic status, adult socioeconomic status, and a scale called the Mini-K. For those of you that are not familiar with the Mini-K, it is a scale that measures behavioral correlates of being a slower life history strategist. So a higher score on the Mini-K would indicate that they're more of a slow strategist. And what we found was, as predicted in previous research, childhood and adult SES are strongly negatively related with vulnerability to disease. So people who come from poorer environments tend to have greater vulnerability to disease, and this has been found in research before. Interestingly, what we also found was that people who were highly vulnerable to illness also tended to score lower on the Mini-K. So they showed less behavioral correlates of being a slow life history strategist. And this is an exact proxy of being a faster strategist, but it does indicate that they were showing less slow life history traits. We also found that the Mini-K was positively related to the ability to delay gratification. So people who scored higher on this measure of slow life history strategy tended to have an easier time delaying gratification, which is what we would predict for a slower life history strategist. What we also found was that people who were highly vulnerable to the disease tended to report that they had a harder time delaying gratification, just like we predicted. And interestingly enough, when we control for all these other life history factors, we still find an effect of vulnerability to disease being negatively related to one's ability to delay gratification and think ahead. So correlational data is great, but it doesn't prove causation. So we wanted to experimentally establish a link between chronic vulnerability to disease and behaving like a faster life history strategist and making present-focused decisions. So we did the same thing before, method-wise, where we gave them the DGI and the same health measures, but first what we did is we primed them. So participants saw either a prime about the rising threat of deadly disease in America. So this prime, it was really scary. I'll preface this with some of my research assistants were terrified after pre-testing this for me. So it talked about how despite advances in medical technology, highly infectious diseases were on the rise due to things like antibiotic resistance, and it painted a very grim future due to disease. If they didn't see that, they saw another negative prime about the rise of academic failure, which discussed how colleges in Texas were raising their standards and how more people were failing out as a result. Also not pleasant if you're an undergraduate. And so again, we gave them the same delaying gratification inventory with a higher score indicating an easier time delaying gratification. We gave them the same measure of vulnerability to illness, which is the developmental and familial history. This time, we also asked people if they were currently ill, though, because we didn't think about this the first time. We're interested in chronic health quality and how that affects decision-making, so we necessarily wanted to control for current illness in our analyses. And so what we found, just to preface this here, these are people who are one standard deviation above and below average vulnerability to disease. And so what we found was that people who are highly vulnerable to disease in control conditions have a harder time delaying gratification than their healthier counterparts do. As we predicted, under conditions of disease threat, they don't show a significant change in their ability to delay gratification. They have an equally hard time thinking up in the future, and they prefer immediate gratification regardless of whether we prime disease threat or not. However, for individuals who are healthy, in control conditions, they have an easy time delaying gratification. This is actually on a scale out of 5, so they have a really easy time. That's a pretty high score. But when you give them disease threat, they drop down significantly and act much like the chronically sick people do after seeing this disease threat. And so in short, we found support for both our predictions that people who are chronically sick will tend to think more in the present and make decisions consistent with a faster life history strategy, and where people who are healthy will typically act more like slow strategists and think ahead, but that when disease threat is high, they will shift to being more present focused as a way to promote immediate survival in the face of disease. And so for future directions, one of the major limitations of our study, as most of you are doctors and have probably already thought of, is this is a self-report measure of disease vulnerability. That's great. It's just people's perceptions of whether they're vulnerable to disease or not. So what we're actually doing right now is we're following this up by taking blood markers of immune quality. So we're working with some neuroscientists and some members of the kinesiology department to take measures. We're going to do NK cell assays and also proliferation assays for T cells, B cells, and pro-inflammatory cytokines, and we're going to look and see how that affects people's decision-making and if we can replicate these effects from the prior 2 studies. And so our prediction is that people who have less reactive immune systems will have a harder time delaying gratification. And I don't know if it's one specific immune system marker or if it's all of them. We'll find that out when we look at the data. We also want to use this data to test for similar effects of other decision-making measures that have been associated with pursuing a faster versus slower life history strategy, such as self-control, impulsivity, and temporal focus. So just in conclusion, to wrap it up, what we found is that when vulnerable to disease, people make decisions that are consistent with a faster life history strategy. And this is because when the shadow of the future is uncertain, it's more adaptive to have a present focus because it helps to survive and reproduce before possibly succumbing to the threat of disease. And another interesting thing to draw from this research is that environmental disease threat and immune system quality may both be important and largely unexplored factors that affect human decision-making and life history strategy. I would just like to thank my advisor, Dr. Sarah Hill, my collaborators, and also my lab mates who have been wonderfully supportive with my neuroses.